Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I hope you all missed me last week. I did have a fun family vacation in Silver Dollar City, so that was a great time, but I sure did miss doing the live chat, so I'm glad to be back. And in this week's live chat, we're gonna be talking about ribbon candy. I know from the texts and the comments before we went live that a lot of people kind of struggle with this design. I'm hoping that by the time I'm done, I will make you love it as much as I do and help you maybe even troubleshoot some issues you're having. Before we get to that though, I want to tell you about this week's weekly deal. So what I have for you is some amazing mystery scrap bags. So I actually have these for 25% off. Just use the promo code RibbonCandy, and the link is in the description box below. And I actually have two different scrap bags. I have one that is about a pound of just quilt shop quality cottons from the shop, and then I have another one that's a pound of my designs. So you can get a scrap bag that's just my fabrics or scrap bag of an assortment. Either way, I won't judge. I think it's great. I love mystery bags and I love scraps, just kind of playing with them. So that's only good through next week. So if you want to take advantage of that, again, the promo code is RibbonCandy and the link is in the description box. All right, let's talk about real quick. Next week, we're having our annual Fall Fest here in Liberty, Missouri. It's just outside of Kansas City. That's where my quilt shop is located. And for the first time, we're participating in this big, fun Fall Fest, and we're getting in the spirit of festivals with our own little quilt fest. So tons of events coming up next weekend. If you happen to be driving through the area or close by, I'll be doing a trunk show, some live demos, and in fact, next week's live chat will be during Quilt Fest, so I'm going to do it live from the quilt shop. So it'll be kind of interesting. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like, but I'm going to give you a tour, show you a little bit of what happens when I'm not in my studio, when I'm in my quilt shop. So again, if you happen to be traveling in the area, I'm only 20 minutes from Kansas City Airport and only 45 minutes from Missouri Star Quilt Company. So kind of right in the smack dab middle of the US. If you happen to be coming through, I hope you'll come by and say hi. All right. But I know why you're here, right? You're here to learn more about ribbon candy and talk about how we can improve that. So let's get right to our goodies. First thing I want to share is I do have two downloadable tip sheets for this design. First one is a free one. It's just a one-page diagram that you can trace along the lines. This is perfect if you just need a little bit of help getting in the hang of how to quilt it. But if you need a little bit more help, you're like, I'm struggling, Angela, I need just a little bit more assistance. I do have an expanded PDF available. It's $2.99, 9 pages full of quilting samples, diagrams, tips, everything that I'm showing in the live chat. So somebody left a comment on my website, was like, oh, why do you have to charge for the expanded sheets? Everything that's in those expanded PDFs is on the live chat. So it's not like you have to get it, but it definitely is helpful if you like something printed right next to you when you're quilting, okay? So you have those options. The free one, all I ask that you do for that is just give the video a thumbs up. That's all you have to do for that one. So let's get right into the ribbon candy. So if you're stumbled along this and you're like, I don't even know what ribbon candy is, it's that beautiful curvy design in the white strip of this quilt. I love to use ribbon candy in thinner areas. So this is not going to be something for a big block. It's not going to be for a really wide border. I generally, if I had to put a limit on it, I would say 2 to 4 inches-ish is kind of where I like to use this design. But there are a lot of places like that. You know, we have our sashings, our thinner borders, our strip piece blocks, or even wedges. And we're going to see all of that. But the reason I don't like to use this in very large areas is that bigger unquilted kind of curve. As the area gets bigger, that unquilted area gets larger as well. And we all know that I love quilting my stuff to death, so I'm gonna go with something more dense in bigger areas. So if you're struggling with it, try to keep it within that range. All right, so let's talk about this design. So the ribbon candy, when I teach this in person, the first thing I say is if you're having trouble drawing it, just stop and listen to me and come back later and trace along it. There's not a whole lot I can say about this design that will make something click. I do have a couple tips, but really I can't stress enough how important it is to try tracing over it. If you're struggling with it, print out that free diagram or get the expanded tip sheet and just draw over it again and again and again until it clicks. But this is how the design starts off. It's going to start off with this backwards S kind of shape, right? So the line is going to curve out in the direction that I'm heading and then kind of curve back like that S. And so it's kind of funny if you think about it. When I started quilting, I never could think, where do I go? How do I start? Well, the direction you're always going to go is the way that you're heading. So if I'm going left to right, my first move is going to be to the right, curving and back around. All right, so now once I hit that bottom backwards S, I'm going to try not to stop. I'm going to continue along and I'm going to do the next part. And it's going to be actually the mirror image of that first shape. So I'm going to swing out and then back. Now, sometimes some quilters will look at this and see two S's, like backwards, mirror images of each other. Or sometimes you'll look at it and see maybe like a Hershey's Kiss or something like that. What makes this design tricky for most quilters is that mirror image, right? You quilt it and you have to flip it back and forth. And it's kind of one of those things where you're like, I got it, I don't got it, I got it, I don't got it. So try not to worry too much, just practice and work through it. So let's talk real quick about this. I kind of, in an ideal world, I kind of want those curves to touch or come close to touching, not necessarily overlap. And I'm also trying to keep the design away from the edge, just about 1/8 of an inch or so. If I have this nice curve, I want to be able to see it. And really, once I get to that part, it's just going to be repeating that shape over and over and over again. And so until I get to the end of my area, and this is what we would be seeing if we were done. Again, if you're having trouble with this, it's going to really be more helpful just to trace over it. One joke I tell in my live classes, I'll say, you know, it's not like our kindergarten teacher just drew a letter on the board and said, write that letter. You had to trace it to get the movement down. But I do have some troubleshooting tips and some things we'll talk about when we get to see how it works. But ideally, this is what we're going for. A nice curvy design that kind of touches but doesn't overlap yet. And that's going to be kind of fun. So let's talk about a couple things. So again, there isn't a whole lot I can say about this, but first, again, I don't want it to touch the area. I want to start my turn before I get to the edge because I want to see that curviness to it. If I wait too long, it's going to kind of chop off the top and bottom, which isn't the end of the world, but then it just looks like a funky kind of serpentine line that we didn't quite nail. So I would rather stop too short than run into the edge. If you end up with too much of a gap between your design and the edge of your area, you can always add echoing to fill it in or just move on. It's going to be fine either way. Okay, again, we're trying to make those curves touch. So what I'm doing is as I come around that next side, I go ahead and put my eye where I want to end up and then trust my hands to bring me to that. So I'm kind of looking where I want to end up. But here's the thing, if I can't do that, if I'm struggling getting it to touch, which let's be honest, nobody's going to make them all touch all the time. If I just really can't do it, I would rather stop short than overlap. So if you're struggling, just make them not touch, get them kind of close and then move on. The reason being, if I have an overlap, if it overlaps a little bit, that's going to be a little bit threadier. It's going to show up a little bit more and it'll be a little bit more noticeable. So if you're going to make a mistake, just decide which mistake looks less like a mistake, and that would be just stopping a little short. Okay, one thing that kind of helps in classes when I travel and teach this is sometimes some quilters think we need to make them touch in the middle, and that's not the case. The curves of the design are actually touching above and below that middle line. So if you were to look at your area and kind of imagine a dashed line that goes right down the center, those curves are going to be above and below it. So if you find yourself constantly trying to make them meet in the middle, that's going to be no fun because they're not supposed to. So those are the 3 things that really seem to help when we're talking about this stuff. Hopefully you can find it a little helpful for you. But again, just practice drawing it over and over again until it clicks and then get to your machine. All right, so let's see some quilted examples here. So this particular example, you can see the ones on the left aren't touching, and then some are touching and then some are overlapping. I wish I could tell you I did that as an instructable example of different variations, but this is actually what I was working with. Some of them touch, some of them don't. Here's the thing about the ribbon candy, right? If you remember from any of my previous live chats, we're drawn to an unquilted area. Our eyes tend to notice that first, and the unquilted area is in those bigger curves. So that's what people are going to notice. So try not to stress too much about that perfection, because when you're all said and done, you're going to see that unquilted area right there. And I did forget to mention in the beginning, if you have any questions and you're watching this live, go ahead and type them out. Jessica's here writing them down for me so I can answer them at the end, because I'm sure there's some questions about ribbon candy. I want to show you a couple examples of them in actual quilts. I kind of poured through all the quilts I have, and I used to not be so great about taking pictures, but I liked this as an example. It can be used in pieced borders or sashings as well. This is obviously Christmas block, a scrappy kind of border, but I'm still treating it as one piece. It has that 2 to 3 inch wide. It just really fits nicely. And I mean, who doesn't love ribbon candy on a Christmas quilt? But I do want to point out that you can use this on any kind of quilts. So traditional, modern, improvisationally pieced, it works everywhere. It's really one of those great versatile designs that once you get the hang of it, I think you're going to love it. Another kind of unexpected place that you might not think of is wedges. Now, if I'm dealing with a shape, let's say it's a stack and whack or a wedge like this, even though it's kind of irregular, it's narrower at one side and wider at the top, you're still going to be able to make it fit that area nicely and quilt it. So if you have those kind of wedge shape, this would be a great option. This or wishbones or something like that. I love it for adding a nice texture to fabrics that I love, that I don't want to take away from the detail in them. And so that's a perfect option of where I would use that design. And a little bit closer up here. So again, just a really nice quick design once you get the hang of it that you can just fly through, and it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, I also love to use it in slightly thinner borders, especially when I have quilts with multiple borders. So if you've ever quilted or pieced a medallion, right? You have border, 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 tons of borders. Sometimes I want something that has a nice texture, but I don't want it to take away from something else in the quilt. So this beautiful, bigger border in this quilt was a very focal fabric, nice and florally. I think it even shimmered a little bit. So in that solid next to it, I just did something nice and consistent to not take away from it. But the ribbon candy was a nice option. And you can see as I go to the next one, I went and did loops. So again, it's just great for those areas that you just want a nice texture. Now I want to say I do use it in 2-inch strips. You can go even smaller, but it gets kind of hard to get that turn. So you can go smaller, but go ahead and master it first in the 2 to 4 inches before you try to extend past that. And again, any kind of strips, any kind of quilt with lots of piecing, I just love the texture it adds, and I love mixing it in with other ones like wishbones, which we saw in an earlier live chat. So it's definitely one of those that you might think, I don't do a lot of quilts with narrow borders, but I think you'll be surprised all the quilts that you do that have strips that you can use it in. All right, let's talk troubleshooting. There's one main troubleshooting thing I have for you here, and it was funny because somebody typed on the chat before I went live, my ribbon candy looks like it's melting. Okay, so let's talk about that. What's happening here? What's happening is I'm not going far enough away to come back. Number one common mistake, right? So the first one starts out great, but then my second one, I don't swing out enough to come back. And so if I always like to joke, like you have to go away before I can, miss you. You have to leave before you can come home. You really have to extend out. So let's see how this could have been fixed. So right here, I should have came out a little bit more and started that. And I will tell you, when you're learning how to quilt, it's so scary to make yourself go out there in that space because it's just kind of hanging out there. But you really have to go out and then come back. That's going to give you that S shape, okay? So if you catch it in time, no worries, just give it a bigger bottom and then get back on track. But just know that this is kind of what's happening there. At any point, if you're like, I don't know what to do, just stop. I remember I would be quilting like, I don't know, but I keep going. Stop and use your finger just to kind of think through the next couple steps, especially if you're alternating between wishbone and ribbon candy because it kind of goes in different ways a little bit and it can be a little confusing. But number one, troubleshooting right there. You want to really extend that piece out so that you can come back. Now, another troubleshooting thing would be, again, the curves not touching. I would just know that comes with practice, or make them spaced out just a bit all the time. Whatever you do, just do it consistently. All right, let's talk about variations. So sometimes for newer quilters, variations of the ribbon candy design might actually be easier to quilt than the traditional one. And you might think, how can that be? I promise it's the case. So this is a variation that I don't use a whole lot, but I love to use it as an example. So here we have alternating hearts, right? So I'm quilting a heart and then quilting my next one, and it gives it a nice, more feminine look. Maybe it's a Valentine's quilt. But even though it has an extra step, right, it has that little kind of dip like a heart, it follows the same flow as the ribbon candy, right? So it still goes and then alternates direction. This is kind of that flow that we're moving with. And if I put them on top of each other, you'll see it kind of still follows that same direction. But I find that if you're struggling with the traditional ribbon candy, you might find this variation easier because most of us have drawn hearts. We've doodled them, we can visualize what that looks like, and it just comes a little bit easier because we know that shape. So start with this, get comfortable with that, and then you can just leave that little dip out of it if you want to. So great variation. If you're struggling with the first one, you can go right to this one and see how that works for you. If that one doesn't work, you can try what I like to call groovy ribbon candy. So this is going to be for bigger areas. This is going to be more of a motif because we're going to build off it. I'll show you some different ways to use it. But it starts with ribbon candy, but I'm just spreading those lines way out. Like this is about 1/4 to 1/2 inch in between them. When you see it like that, it might not be so difficult, right? Because you're like, oh, good, I can't make them touch anyway. I can just spread them out. But what we're going to do is after we quilt this line, we're going to echo the top and the bottom to really build it up. So again, this is going to be for bigger areas or where I want to add a little bit of a wow factor. So I've quilted my first line. Now I'm just echoing the top. So just came right back, filling in that area, echoing my way back to where I started. And then once I hit the end, I'm gonna do the same on the bottom. So isn't that fun? I love it. Love, love, love it. The thing about this is don't worry about keeping the spacing of those echo lines precise. I think it looks better if the spacing gets closer in some parts and wider in others. That's what's really gonna give it that kind of flowy shape. And since you're kind of starting with that main line and just echoing around it, you can kind of relax the last two steps because you're just echoing what you've already quilted. Now let's see what this looks like quilted, or quilted example. Again, it's gonna build it up. It has a much more funky kind of look. Maybe not for every quilt, but I have used this in some interesting ways. And if you love the design you've quilted, echo around it and then put some filler around that, and that will help it stand out. Or if you look at the ends of the ribbon candy, here's in a class where I kind of get like super excited about the examples and people are like, oh my gosh, stop talking about it. But one of my favorite ways to use this is to build off of it. If you look at the top and the bottoms, they're really just like clamshells. So I can quilt this along an area and add clamshells on both sides to really fill it in as a big border design, or again, as an all over, or as an area of some kind of area I want to draw attention to. So really have fun with it, combining it with other designs, even ones that you might not think of, like clamshells. Now, if you caught the Wishbones live chat, you might remember this quilt because I showed it as an example of using wishbones in between. But this quilt I did for Tulip Pink, I mean, it was so fun and striking. I wanted to do something fun and funky, and so I used that same wavy kind of, or the groovy ribbon candy in the white strips. So quilted those, echoed, and then filled in between it. And we can see a little bit closer right here. So if you're a little bit more experienced with quilting, you want a little bit of a challenge, you're like, this doesn't scare me, give me something hard to do, you can fill in the unquilted areas with something like pebbles to really make those lines pop, okay? So make sure you do it though in an area of the quilt that you can actually see, because if I'm gonna take the time to do all this, I wanna make sure that it's noticeable. So you can really kind of dress that up as much as you want. But if I were to pick the variation that I use the most, it would be the overlapping ribbon candy. So you might be like, huh, my ribbon candy overlaps already. Well, great, you're just ahead of the curve. That's fantastic. I like to use overlapping ribbon candy for bigger areas, right? So remember, I like to quilt my stuff to death. You know, if I have like a 4-inch border, I might overlap it so that it gives it a little bit more density. So we're gonna talk about how to do that, and I'll tell you the trick to make sure it looks intentional, because it can really easily look like you just messed up. So the first part starts the same, right? If nothing else, we'll have this very first part down before you're done with this live chat. But the next time when I swing up and come around, I'm gonna make them overlap, okay? Here's the trick though, I want it to look intentional. So it needs to overlap by about 1/4 inch or more. If it only overlaps a little bit, it's just gonna look like you tried to make them touch and didn't quite make it, okay? So if you're gonna make that mistake or you're gonna do it, go big, go all the way, go 1/4 inch or even more. Another thing I want to point out is I really, really want to make sure I don't quilt the top and bottom of this into the edge of the area, because then it's just going to look like wishbones. It'll kind of cut off that curve. And not that there's any problem with it looking like wishbones, but dang it, if I took the time to quilt overlapping ribbon candy, I kind of want it to show up. So those would be the two things I would watch out for. And then as you're going, just overlapping them. Now, here's a little caveat. If you have quilted the traditional ribbon candy for quite a while, you might find this variation difficult. I know I did. I was like, I'm so used to making them touch, it feels wrong to try to overlap it. So just know that you might find this easier or harder depending on your experience. So here we can see I have it overlapped. And then one thing I will point out, I'm just gonna go until I get to the end of the area, but if it bothers you, that last little loop not having the overlap, it's okay, we can fill that in. We can just add a bit of traveling and pretend like we're quilting part of that ribbon candy. So you can definitely make that work for you. So again, I'm gonna use overlapping ribbon candy. I use it probably more than the traditional, but especially in larger areas, and we can see, again, a little bit of what that looks like. We wanna make it look intentional. We wanna make it look like we're doing it. So I wanna show you also a couple areas in irregularly shaped areas. So we're gonna talk about that too, but if you can look around, there's kind of like this diamond with that ribbon candy in there. Using this design in irregularly shaped areas is really fun, okay? So we saw this with wishbones. The case is definitely the same with the ribbon candy as well. If you think about it, we are just using the edges of our area as a guide, and we're just going from side to side. Now, if those areas get further apart, they just happen to be wider, and if they get narrower, they happen to be shorter. So if that is an irregular area, it can still fit it, even if it's more geometric or even wavy. So here we can see the overlapped in a wedge shape. So irregular area, kind of like I was talking about earlier, but combining it with the traditional to the overlap, it's just gonna fill that in nicely. So you can kind of have fun with that, combine them together or do them all overlap. All right, so let's look at this in an irregular area. Basically anything that's not a straight rectangle. It could be between quilting designs, it could be between a block and the edge of the area, it could be, you know, between 2 blocks, whatever. The thing is, I'm gonna keep quilting until I get ready to run into the edge, and I'm gonna begin my loop and come back around. The trickiest part with this is just being comfortable with knowing some of them are gonna look weird. You're gonna get areas that are too small or too big right next to each other, and you might think, oh, it doesn't look right. Just keep going. It's gonna be fine, I promise. So filling in the area as much as possible. With this particular one, when I'm doing this in between other designs, it's usually a filler, and it's usually its only job is to show off the thing that it's in between, just kind of flatten that. So I'm not worried too much if they're not perfect. I am trying to make sure that I'm filling in that whole area as much as possible. And that means I might quilt it really close to the edge if that's quilted line as much as possible. But that's just my own thing. So here we can see I used it on the top and bottom on this example, in between quilting and the edge of the area. Really easy way to do that, to fill it in and give you a nice curvy bit without the density of the back and forth lines. So this might be something I put around something else that I want to give it a nice filler, but I don't want to make it like, whoo, here it is. It's kind of right in between. So again, as the area gets bigger, those are going to get taller, and it gets smaller, it gets smaller. It's just how it works. Or on the top of this quilt, you can see another example of that between the edge of the area and those wavy lines. It's a great way to break it up, give yourself something else to do. I'm easily bored, but easily amused. It tends to even out eventually. But again, irregular areas, this is how I use it a lot. All right, so hopefully I've talked you into liking it. You're like, okay, I think I'm gonna give it a shot. Just know there's other ways you can use this design. So even though I like to use it in strips and sashing and borders, you can use it as an all-over design. So let's pretend you have a whole big area, whether it's a big block, whether it's the whole quilt, and you can use your marking pen or your marking tool to mark sections. So those horizontal lines are markings that I've made to divide it up into smaller areas to make it more manageable. And then I can just fill in that space with the ribbon candy until the whole area is filled in. This is great practice. If you are struggling with it and you're like, I want to love it, but I can't get it, you do this over a whole quilt, you'll have it mastered, especially if it's a busier fabric that you can't see the quilting anyway. Anyway, once you fill in the whole area, then you can just remove those marking lines and you have this nice consistent texture over the whole area. A little bit unusual, but definitely lots of fun, and this kind of shows you what that looks like on a quilted sample. And you can kind of have fun with these too. I mean, you can mark out where it's wider on one end and narrower on the other, or you can make them all the same size. You can have a lot of fun with that. But just make sure you fill in everything as much as possible. So definitely a nice texture for an area of the quilt that you want to add something to. Another way you can do it in background areas is quilt rows of them and then fill them in with something else. This is, again, how I like to manage quilts, especially on my sewing machine. I like to take that area and break it up into chunks and fill it in. It's kind of like fill it in and kind of continue on. Just makes it a little bit easier to manage. And if you remember when I talked about combining designs a couple weeks ago, I said use what you feel comfortable to transition to what feels uncomfortable. So if you like quilting swirls, putting those in between your ribbon candy kind of gives you a little bit of break, a little bit of a mental rest before you do it again. So again, just another way to use it. All right, let's talk about corners, because it's all fun and games till you have to turn a corner. Now, if you watched the Wishbones live chat, I talked about how I have 3 different ways I turn the corners with the wishbone. And the first one was to pivot it around that corner. I will say for the most part, I don't do that with the ribbon candy. I really don't like how it looks trying to pivot it or quilt it in that area. So this is how I would handle larger borders. I would just imagine that line from the inner corner to the outer corner and fill in that area with the ribbon candy. If I were to be doing this on a slightly bigger border. This is going to kind of help it fill it in and just make it easier than turning that corner. And sometimes this would be the case, especially if I have some kind of pieced border. And so this wraparound, this is a bigger block that I've kind of broke down, but you can see in the corners where I'm quilting that ribbon candy and it gets smaller, and then I switch. Now I did alternate designs. I went right into that wishbone, but that's a perfect example of how you could use it in that corner. But if I'm being honest with you, that's not even what I do a lot. What I do probably 95% of the time is just skip it. I just do something different in that corner. It's so much easier and it still looks great. So if I had something like this, I'm just gonna imagine that that border corner is a square. I'm gonna quilt my ribbon candy up to that and then switch design, switch to something else, and then continue on the other side. And even though I've done a square that kind of echoes in on itself, you could do a swirl, you can do continuous curve, you can do anything, just something different in there so you don't have to even think about it. Now, I will say there is an exception to that rule. I will go around the corner if it's not a 90-degree angle. So if you think about a border corner, you have a 90-degree, your right angle. If it's a little bit more subtle, or it's like kind of opened up a little bit like this, I will wrap it around the corner. So if it's like a 60-degree angle or something like that, if it is, it's a little bit easier to turn that corner. So I'm thinking like pieced hexagons, if you've ever worked on a quilt like that, or this kind of border that turns a corner, but it's at an angle. It's a lot easier than that right angle. And this example I found just today, I was so excited to find it, another example of wrapping it around the corner. So this is kind of where I use the quilting to make this big kind of octagon and then just had those corners to work with. I'll show you what it looks like on the back. So I will turn the corner if it's not that 90-degree. If it's, you know, different, then I'll make it work. So a lot of fun. All right, another way that you can really make this look a little bit more custom is to add echoing. Okay, so I talked about this in Wishbones, but I didn't really break it down for you. Echoing is just going to give you a little bit of separation between the quilting and the edge of the area. And I echo it first and then fill in. So I'm quilting my line across the edge from whatever I'm working with, but then I'm going to use traveling along the side to echo back. So traveling or stitching in that seam is going to help me maneuver around the area and make it so much easier. Now that I have my area defined, then I can go ahead and fill it in with that ribbon candy design. So that was something I didn't really go into on the Wishbone. I am adding echoing, but I'm not breaking thread. I'm just traveling and moving on. And here you can see an example of that with not only the Wishbone, or not only the ribbon candy, but a variation of the Wishbone. I love how the echoing separates it from the other pieces. It just gives it a little bit more of a custom look, and it doesn't take that much longer. So if you have a particular block or something you want to show off, this is a great way to do it. Or if you're working on a quilt that has curved flying geese, people, I'm like, this quilt is crazy. It's by Carl Hinch, and I was like, oh, there's no way I would ever be able to piece this, but I'm going to quilt it and really show off those beautiful pieces with that echoing and the ribbon candy. So echoing is definitely an easy way to really give your quilting a custom look. So hopefully, though, you'll feel inspired with all those examples, like, okay, if nothing else, hopefully they make you feel like inspired to give it a shot. So I'm sure there's a few questions that have come through. Jessica, do we have any questions on that? I know with the ribbon candy, I promise it just takes practice. And I know people hate hearing that. Imagine taking a class, paying for it, and I'm like, oh, it just takes practice. Okay, one question, this is great. I didn't talk about this. Mine slowly gets smaller. How can I stay consistent? Practice. Consistency is always going to come with practice, but if you're working within a defined area, really look to that edge. You know, you're using that edge as a guide. When you get about a quarter or a little bit more than a quarter of an inch away, begin your turn, and that will kind of help you. Another thing could be marking it out and then just kind of quilting. I will say that, though, the more you practice a design, it gets easier to keep that size consistent, whether it's bigger or smaller. But on the opposite side, if you're having trouble keeping it consistent, well, then just echo around it and fill it in. Either one's going to be fine. My loops always lean. How do I go straight? Okay, so that's kind of that thing I was talking about where you have to swing out to really come back. That's going to keep you from leaning, right? So imagine that backwards S, or imagine that part of that heart, you know, that you see there. Another thing that could help, and I should have drew this out for you. If you look at your area and imagine rectangles, right? You can even mark your rectangles. Your S is going to fit that rectangle. And then when you flip it, that's also going to fit the rectangle. So they should be the same width no matter which direction it is. But the fact that we're doing it in one movement feels like we're going way out there and coming back. So hopefully that helps. If it doesn't, I promise it's just that you're not coming out enough to come back. So you have to really swing out there. And I don't know why I move my hands, because that's not helping you, but I feel like it makes my words make more sense. I don't know. It is what it is. I'm ending up with eyelashes on the back as I'm going around the curve. Do I need to slow down? It depends. It could be that you need to slow down, or you need to just speed up the machine. So those eyelashes, if they're happening in one part of the design, not all the time, just one part, it just means there's a movement there that's not as similar as the rest. Like maybe you're moving faster, or you're pulling the quilt a little bit more. Try not to get frustrated by that. It will work itself out. But I will say with this design, you're kind of doing curves and straightaways a little bit. And so it's going to be a little bit of that play in between the speed of your machine and your hands. And it will come with practice. I know, I'm sorry to say that. It doesn't sound good, but it is true. But if you're getting eyelashes just on that part, it could mean that you need to speed up a little bit. But try to make your machine match your hands. So if you need to speed up your machine or slow it down so it matches your hands, that's going to be a little bit easier. I'm left-handed and have trouble connecting left to right. Do you recommend tracing right to left? Absolutely. I should have said this. You can trace either way you want. I mean, kind of like the wishbone. Ideally, we want to be able to quilt this design in all different directions, but when we're learning, we don't want to learn that way. That's too much to learn. Let's learn it one direction and then turn the corner. Whatever feels comfortable for you. Even though I kind of go left to right, you might find up and down is better, or even right to left. It doesn't matter. So try all 4 different directions, and whichever one makes you feel less sick, that's the one you should try. So yes. Any update on the next quilt along? Little happy face. I love it. Yes, so that is coming along great. All of our test prints have been approved. We got fabric coming in. We are tentatively looking at announcing it the beginning of October. And you know, I love my live chat crew, so I'm going to be announcing it here. So I'll keep you updated. I'm waiting just to see how things come in before I give it a final date, but we're looking right at the beginning of October to announce it. So I'm so excited. It's very colorful, very bright. It is probably one of my favorites, I'll say. Although each one is my favorite. The one that I'm at is usually my favorite. But it's going to be fun, and I'm looking forward to showing it to you. And also, I'm trying to incorporate, no promises, but I'm trying to think about how do I make this easier for the long armors. So I'm thinking maybe different quilting diagram placements for long armors. So we'll just see how that comes out. So excited to tell you guys about that. It's coming really soon. Maybe the week after next. If Jessica lets me, I'll announce it the week after next. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, all right, well, I'll see you next week for the live chat where we're going to go live from the quilt shop. And if you can't make it to that area, no problem. We'll be on here. And I appreciate you guys watching and hanging out with me. I'll see you next week, and stay safe, everybody. Bye, and happy quilting.